the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder. Each episode, we look at a topic related to pop culture or geekdom and have conversations that use science fiction, fantasy, gaming, or comic books as a jumping off point to talk about deeper issues and to wrestle with the big questions of life. Before I begin with this week's topic, I first want to follow up on last week's episode on the unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. In episode 9, I considered a number of elements about the Tina Fey comedy, but I did not consider whether the show accurately reflected the experience of leaving a cult, what it's like to leave a cult and to try to rebuild your life. The blog Her.Minutics on Christianity Today has a great piece by cult survivor and author Elizabeth Esther on what the unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt gets right and what it gets wrong. I will be posting a link on Facebook and tweeting it as well, but you definitely want to check out that article. Now, when this podcast posts, it will be during Holy Week, and next week is Easter, which is the most important time for the Christian church. Easter is the time on the Christian calendar when the church remembers the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Easter is the climax in the gospel. It is the moment when Mary Magdalene and some other women discover that the tomb is empty and that the promises made by God and by Jesus has been fulfilled and that there is a new relationship between God and humanity. The crucifixion and Easter are at the center of Christian theology and what it means to follow Jesus. So I wanted to respond to Easter and this season by talking about some other resurrection stories that show up in Geekdom and elsewhere. Now, along with Jesus, there are lots of resurrection stories in the ancient world. We find in certain texts that there's a trope of the dying and rising god. Osiris, for example, in Egypt, or Baal in the Canaanite religion. Buddhism has the legend of Bodhidharma, which involves a monk. Greek mythology has Achilles. And folk culture has zombies and vampires and other kinds of stories about dead rising up. At the heart of all these stories are some fundamental questions about life and death. Many of these stories are ways for us to deal with our own fear and our own concern and our own worry about death and what happens after we die, after we're no longer inhabiting this mortal coil. In regards to religion, these stories of death and resurrection speak into what does it mean for us to relate to God? What is our relationship with God? If I can be Pastor Yoder for just a moment here, the reason why Easter is so important to Christian theology is because it's at the center of this idea of the atonement. And what atonement simply is the process or procedure of how humanity reconciles with God or the gods. How do we ask for forgiveness for when we sin, for when we make mistakes, for when we miss the mark? Now, the Old Testament had a sacrificial system. In the Old Testament, the Jews had to travel to Jerusalem several times a year, where they believed that God dwelled at the temple, and they needed to sacrifice goats or sheep or doves in order to atone for their sins. Now, Christians believe that Jesus' crucifixion does away with this sacrificial system because Jesus himself is that sacrifice. At least that's according to certain kinds of theologies. Over the 2,000 years of Christianity, there have been 4 primary theologies of the atonement. The very earliest one is what we call moral influence, and it dates to about the 2nd century. And this view of the atonement understood Jesus as bringing a positive moral change to humanity. And so therefore the crucifixion and the resurrection was a positive example of how we are to love other people. What does sacrificial love mean? Well, Jesus here represents that, laying his life down for humanity. Another early theology on the atonement is the Christus Victor theory. It's the idea that through the death and resurrection, Jesus Christ is triumphant over the powers of evil which have held dominion over the world because of sin. Now, in the midst of Christus Victor, there's this really kind of weird, strange thing called the ransom theory. And it's the idea that Jesus Christ was ransomed, that his death was ransom for humanity's sin, that God was paying humanity's sin by ransoming Jesus to Satan. However, God was also tricking Satan because Jesus could not be kept bound by death, that this was an invalid transaction because Jesus transcended the terms. And so Satan thought that for humanity's sins, he was getting the death of Jesus, and discovered on Easter morning that none of that was valid, and so was tricked by God. We see this view with early theologians like Origen. What's interesting is that Christus Victor, with the exception of that ransom theory, is in the last 20 years or so seen a resurgence, in part because it connects well with progressive liberation theologies that understand Jesus' triumphant victory over the powers, not just simply in supernatural terms, that Jesus is also victorious over oppressive power structures and principalities. And that connects very well with the theological concern for marginal people and political activism. The third primary theory on the atonement is the satisfaction theory, which was developed by Anselm of Canterbury in the Middle Ages, and it understood the crucifixion of Jesus as making restitution for the sins of humanity. It is connected to the ransom theory, but it is a further development of it. And this theory had great influence in the Middle Ages over theologians like Thomas Aquinas, and in the Reformation over theologians like John Calvin. Now, the final primary theory of the atonement is the one that most people think about, and that's penal substitution. And that comes out of the Reformed tradition. That's John Calvin. And what the penal substitution theory says is that Jesus' own choice to be crucified in the place of sinners substituted and satisfied God's demand for justice. That God is able to forgive sins because Jesus represented a substitute sacrifice. That there had to be blood, because looking back at the Old Testament system of sacrifice, and Jesus was that blood. So those are the four basic understandings and theories of the atonement, of what happens on Easter. And it has to be said that all four of them have support in Scripture. You can read different verses, you can read different scriptures that emphasize certain things and draw the conclusion that each one of these is correct. Of course, there's also a lot of disagreement about them and what really is the true understanding of the atonement. But we're not going to get into that. The reason why I mentioned these four understandings of the atonement is because of the power and the importance of the Jesus Christ trope in Western culture. In part because Christianity has dominated Western culture for over 1,000 years. We see allusions and representations of Jesus Christ pop up all the time in our culture. Whenever we see a sacrificial death or a near-death experience where someone dies or almost dies for the good of others, sacrifices himself, it's making a reference to Jesus Christ. Often they'll make it really obvious, where the sacrificial character, the Jesus Christ character, has his arms outstretched as if on a cross. So in Geekdom, these characters include Nero in The Matrix, Harry Potter, E.T., Ripley in Aliens 3, Charlton Heston in The Omega Man. There's a really weird scene in Spider-Man 2, the original Spider-Man 2, Conan the Barbarian, Solomon Kane, Mad Max, RoboCop, and of course Gandalf, who sacrifices himself for others and is transformed from Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White. In this episode, I'll be looking at 3 specific cases in Geekdom that feature characters who undergo death and resurrection: Spock, Superman, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, one of the things that most people remember about Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, is that Spock sacrifices himself in order to save the Enterprise. The Enterprise is having some kind of malfunction. Khan has directed the Genesis beam towards the Enterprise. The spaceship's about to blow up. They're all about to die. And Spock runs down into a compartment that has been flooded by radiation in order to fix the engine, or whatever you want to call it. And he opens up the door, and he puts on these gloves, and he saves the Enterprise, and of course dies from the radiation, after transferring his katra, or his essence, his spiritual essence, or his soul, to the unconscious McCoy. Now, originally, this sequence was supposed to be the end of Spock. Leonard Nimoy had long had ambivalent feelings about Spock. He had written a book literally called I Am Not Spock. And so Nimoy at that time was done with the character. He did not want to be in Star Trek II, but he agreed because he was promised by the producers a dramatic death scene. And Nimoy believed that if Spock could die, then perhaps he would finally be able to move on and to do other roles and not always have this character hanging over him. An early draft of the script had Spock shot and killed in the first act, and this script leaked out and Nimoy received death threats, which of course makes absolutely no sense, but that's what people are like. But even in the final film, where Spock dies honorably and sacrificially, his death had to be softened. Test audiences hated the original cut, and so the producers and the director added additional scene, gave a little more hope to the situation. That Spock's casket lands on the Genesis planet and implies that perhaps he will return. Roger Ebert wrote on Spock's death, "He made a choice in Star Trek II that would be made only by a hero, a fool, or a Vulcan, and he calls it the best scenes in Star Trek II." Now, even though Spock's death was intended to be irrevocable, Nimoy had second thoughts. He had had such a positive experience filming Star Trek II that he asked the producers if it might not be possible for Spock to be resurrected. And of course, Spock was resurrected in Star Trek III. But as often is with these stories, that resurrection does not come without cost, and the Enterprise is destroyed in the midst of the film. The death and resurrection of Spock is one of the first significant examples of this trope in geekdom, and it also set another precedence, that nothing is forever. That even though Spock died in Star Trek II, he comes back in Star Trek III. That even though the Enterprise is destroyed in Star Trek III, it comes back in Star Trek IV. Because when it comes to characters that they love, or spaceships that they love, fans like stability. They want things to stay the same. There is something comforting about the lack of change in film and in comic books. What often happens then is that creators try to push the boundary. They try to be edgy, but then they step back from that edge and they hit a reset button and everything goes back to the way it had been. Perhaps one of the most egregious examples of this was the death and resurrection of Superman. Now, Superman has often been compared to Jesus Christ, and in some ways it makes sense. One way of looking at both Jesus and Superman is as superhumans, or what Nietzsche would have referred to as the Übermensch, that they have additional powers, they have additional strength. Both of them are out to save humanity. Now, Zack Snyder's Man of Steel makes this point explicitly. In one scene, Clark Kent is in a church debating whether to sacrifice himself for humanity, and he's sitting in front of a stained glass window which depicts Jesus at the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Gospels, Jesus is at Gethsemane, debating with himself, praying that he does not have to go through the crucifixion. And so this ends up being a very obvious in-your-face connection between Jesus and Superman. But this comparison is problematic. Unlike Superman, who is an alien pretending to be human, as Clark Kent, Orthodox Christianity believes that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. This is what we call the incarnation. One of the biggest debates in the first 300 years of Christianity was what percentage of Jesus was human, what percentage of Jesus was divine. And the classic formulation of this is that he was both fully human and fully divine. Superman also is invincible. And so even though while Superman is invincible to most things except for kryptonite, Jesus is both tortured and crucified just like any other human being. Because Jesus has a fully human body, he suffers just like any other human. So in 1992 and 1993, DC Comics did a multi-issue 3-arc story in which the villain Doomsday kills Superman in this massive fistfight. And even though Superman kills Doomsday, he succumbs to his wounds and he dies in Lois Lane's arms. And after a bunch of weird stuff that happens, such as the 4 fake Supermen, it turns out that Superman is not really dead, but rather that he's gone to some kind of regeneration matrix. He's in a coma as his body heals. And so all of a sudden, fans were upset to discover that Superman wasn't really dead, that he came back in less than a year, and this storyline, it can be argued, damaged comics and it damaged fans' connection with comics. As Max Landis points out in his YouTube video, Death and Return of Superman, DC Comics did not kill Superman, but rather they killed Death in comics. Death in comics has become meaningless. It no longer carries the weight that it used to. Since 1993, there's been a whole pantheon of superheroes who have died but been resurrected. Batman, Bucky Barnes, who becomes Winter Soldier, Captain America, Colossus, the Hal Jordan, Green Lantern, Hawkeye, Mockingbird, Superboy, Robin, Supergirl, Spider-Man, Nick Fury, Johnny Storm, Professor X, and The Flash. And I realize, of course, that Jean Grey is another superhero who died and resurrected, but I believe that was before 1993. And so with that kind of record, with that kind of superhero mortality that gets reset over and over and over as these superheroes then come back, who here really believes that Wolverine, who's the current dead superhero, isn't going to come back within the next year or two? I do think the criticism is correct that by killing Superman, DC Comics cheapened death. They tried to sell more comic books by shocking people. And when it turned out to be not real, a ruse, that Superman wasn't really dead, fans felt cheapened and were angered by that. And so since then, we've experienced over and over again that death in many of these stories doesn't really mean much. It is pretty meaningless because we know that the characters that we love and emotionally invest in are going to come back even when they die. Now, there is a creator in Geekdom who is rather relentless about killing off beloved characters. And of course, that is Joss Whedon, who has never created a much beloved character that he didn't think he could kill. And as difficult as it is to watch a character like Wash or Anya or Shepard die, there's a certain kind of integrity to it. There are stakes in Joss Whedon films and shows. We don't know who is going to survive. There is an actual sense of danger because sometimes these characters come back, but most of the time they don't. The most significant character that Joss Whedon ever killed was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, the decision to kill Buffy, like Spock in Star Trek II, had to do with finding a way of ending the story, of ending the character. The first 5 seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer had been on the WB network, and the show was canceled. And so the question was, what do we do with the characters? And so the decision was made to end out by killing Buffy. As the mythology of the show goes, Buffy is a slayer, and each generation, one slayer rises up who fights these vampires, who fights these demons, and there can only be one. And her time ends when she dies, and then the next slayer comes out. So it was a way of trying to give Buffy some ending. So in season 5, an exiled hell god named Glory kidnaps Buffy's sister, Dawn, who is really actually the key to a portal to a demon dimension. And Glory and her minions build this huge platform from which they're going to kill Dawn and open up this portal and, of course, bring along the end of the world. Buffy rescues Dawn, and they're standing on the top of this platform, and Buffy realizes that her own blood will close this portal. And she looks out from this platform, and there is this expression of acceptance and release on her face. And so what ends up happening is that Buffy throws herself through the portal, falls, lands, and dies. One of the themes of the show is the responsibility of being the Slayer. It is a burden. There's no chance of having a normal life. Buffy regularly encounters and fights evil, and she sees friends and loved ones hunted and hurt and killed. In a vision, the first Slayer tells Buffy that her gift is death. And so while Buffy's death is a sacrificial death, it is also a release. It is also a gift. It is also a liberation. As Buffy tells Dawn, quote, "The hardest thing in this world is to live in it. Be brave, live," unquote. Of course, Buffy's death is not the end of the story, even though that was its original intention, because the show didn't end. It moved from the WB to UPN and was resurrected. And so suddenly you have this problem, right? The show continues on a new network, and your main character is dead. So Buffy had to be resurrected. Now the Scoobies, her little gang of friends, try to resurrect Buffy, and Willow the Witch insists that Buffy has been trapped in some sort of hell demon dimension and needs to be rescued. And so the Scoobies begin to mess with powers that they shouldn't be messing with. And so they do this ritual, and their ritual is interrupted by a demon motorcycle gang. And they scatter, believing that the ritual has failed. Except it didn't. Buffy comes back. Buffy comes back in her casket and is forced to climb out of her own grave. There are significant consequences for messing with these powers. Throughout most of season 6, Buffy is lost. She's often dressed in white and in tan. She is separate. She is lost. She's searching. And in the famous musical episode, Buffy, wearing red for the first time in that season, reveals that she was not in a hell, but rather that she was in heaven. That her well-meaning friends messing with powers that they didn't understand, walking into a situation that they shouldn't have, did more damage than good by resurrecting Buffy. By the end of season 6, Buffy reconnects with humanity around her. She connects with her sister Dawn, and in the final episode, she climbs out of another grave. That Buffy experiences a rebirth that brings her back into humanity, back into life. Why do we tell these stories? Why is death and resurrection so important to us? In some ways, of course, it's a great way of creating drama. It can be a very cynical way of creating excitement and interest in a story. But I also think that it gives us hope. Certainly as Christians, we believe that Jesus Christ is our ultimate hope. But even if you don't believe, we are constantly experiencing death in our lives. Change is a form of death. All form of change is a kind of death. Whenever we go through a difficult time, when the world that we understood and the world that we knew is no longer there, we're experiencing a kind of death. But often we experience life as well. We experience new life. That something new emerges in our lives that is good and that we can enjoy and that gives us hope and gives us comfort. Certainly the cycles of the year are filled with death and rebirth. Summer becomes fall, and fall becomes winter, winter becomes spring. As the old song by Cake says, as soon as we are born, we start dying. But often we also experience life in the midst of that death. At the center of Christian faith is this experience of death, but also this experience of new life, the hope of new life. Humanity needs stories like this. If you like Geek Cross, please help us out and leave us a review on iTunes. You can find Geek Cross on Facebook and Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @GeekCrossShow. You can email us at geekcrossShow@gmail.com. Geek Cross is a McLaren production. My name is Jeremy Yoder. Thanks for listening.